Hello again, HI 102. In this video I will go over the first part of Chapter 18, the society in the Gilded Age and the post-Civil War era up through the early 20th century. In this slide here you can see where the large urban concentration is in 1880. It's mainly the industrial Northeast, and at that time you can see just how relatively uninhabited the Midwest and West was because of the fact that the Native American tribes who lived in these regions were nomadic. They had their way of life revolved around the buffalo, and they would follow the bison herds north or south depending upon the time of year, hunting and gathering as they followed those herds. And eventually many of the new immigrants and other immigrants from the industrial Northeast will inhabit these regions, and many of these cities will develop in Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, and LA by 1920 is the home of the fledgling motion picture industry, which will be tied in with Rochester, New York, the home of Eastman Kodak Company, which invented modern photography, and they helped build the film industry with their products. After the Civil War, many Americans, millions of Americans, will move from rural areas to the cities because there's not as much need for them anymore on the farms because agriculture is becoming mechanized. 4 men could now perform the work that had earlier required 14. While the far west had the greatest proportion of urban dwellers, that's just a statistical number, and it's concentrated in the cities like San Francisco and Denver. Overall, the Northeast just dwarfs how many people are living in the West, as you can see again from this particular slide. 60% of the population lives in urban areas in the industrial Northeast of the Great Lakes and East Coast region. But more and more of these city dwellers didn't have any money, and they had nothing to offer but their labor. And by 1900, 90% of the people in New York City's most densely populated borough, Manhattan, lived in what were called tenements. Many of them were new immigrants, and they were packed like sardines into poorly ventilated and poorly lit apartments. By 1900, 2.3 million people, 2/3 of the city's entire population, were living in these overcrowded and often filthy tenements. Tenement apartment buildings were the old buildings of New York, about 6 to 8 stories high, with no elevators, and they're jammed right against one another, with little to no natural light or fresh air. The buildings usually housed between 24 and 32 families, usually with lots of children who played out in the streets. On average, there's only one privy for every 20 people. In one New York tenement apartment, 12 adults slept in a room only 13 feet square. As a result, 19th century cities were dirty, smelly, disease-ridden places. Child mortality is extremely high. Garbage and sewage is dumped into the streets. As a result, there are frequent epidemics of cholera, typhoid fever, and in the summer, yellow fever. And in one poor Chicago district at the end of the century, 3 out of every 5 babies died before their first birthday. That leads into the second question: who were the new immigrants of the late 19th century? Now, between more 1880 and 1920, most of the immigrants are from Eastern and Southern Europe in search of a better way of life. And in 1890, 4 out of every 5 New Yorkers were foreign-born, a higher proportion than any other city in the world, and Chicago's not far behind. Most of them had stopped at Ellis Island, where they were questioned by authorities. Many of them would get tagged with an X on their back, and then they're forced to go live in quarantine because many of them had some of these diseases that were quite common that we take for granted today. We never hear of cholera. We don't hear of typhoid fever anymore. That's one of the triumphs of the 20th century, ladies and gentlemen, was the eradication of many of those commonplace diseases just 100 years ago. And Ellis Island is not far from the Statue of Liberty. Before 1880, they're mostly Protestants and Roman Catholics, Irish from Northern and Western Europe. Again, this changes, and they mostly come after this time from Russia, Poland, Greece, Italy. And these are different people that came before. They have different cultures. They use different languages. And most of them are Jewish, Eastern Orthodox Christian, and they're also Roman Catholic. Italians were heavily Roman Catholic. But Protestants were still the majority of the total U.S. population. As a result, there is a backlash against these newcomers. Nativists, or native-born Americans, viewed these people as being a threat to their way of life. They're largely racist. They believe that the Anglo-Saxon Americans were superior to Slavic, Italian, Greek, and Jewish newcomers. A Stanford University professor called the immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe illiterate, docile, and lacking in self-reliance and initiative, and not possessing the Anglo-Teutonic conceptions of law and order and government. And it culminates in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was driven by the West Coast racists. And this is showing John Chinaman being escorted out by Lady Liberty. And why were the Chinese targeted? By 1880, they're 75% of the population of California. They were not white, they're not Christian, many of them couldn't read English or write English, and whites resented them because they took their jobs. They are very industrious people. In many instances, they're willing to do the work that whites refuse to do. The Transcontinental Railroad coming from California to Promontory Point, Utah, would have never made it through the Rocky Mountains without the aid of Chinese labor. They were experts with explosives, and they blasted most of the rock that was cleared away in order to lay the track. And that leads into the third question, how urban growth and an increasingly important role of science influence leisure activities, culture life, and social policy in the Gilded Age. All of this technological progress contributed to the prestige of modern science, which increased enormously in the second half of the 19th century by encouraging what one writer called a mania for facts. Scientists generated changes throughout the social, intellectual, and cultural life. I tell you, these are great times, said Henry Adams. Man has mounted science and is now run away. Scientific research led to transformational technologies, electric power and light, as we talked about, telephones, phonographs, motion pictures, bicycles, and in the early 20th century, the most transformational technology of all, the automobile, Henry Ford. And this led to changes in leisure activities. Many people in the cities would go to vaudeville acts. It's only a penny, where you could see live performances on stage, comedy, drama, speakers, early motion pictures sometimes. The sheer number of city dwellers also helped to generate new forms of mass entertainment, such as Traveling Wild West Show, Buffalo Bill's Traveling Wild West Show, vaudeville shows, as we said, cycling. Some of these cycling races, bicycle races, would go on for a week. Spectator sports like college football, basketball, and professional baseball began attracting fans because of the mass transit system. The streetcar systems helped people to get around much more easily, and these different areas would get baseball teams that would use the transit system to travel to other areas, and they would compete against other ethnic and racial groups from other cities, and this is why baseball takes off and becomes America's pastime in the early 20th century. Just about every town and city had their ball clubs, and it was a way to make a living for some of these new immigrants. And in the second generation of many of these immigrant groups, they would become Americanized. The saloon was another form of entertainment for the working man. It offered fellowship to these guys who were working many, many hours and many days a week. New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago. Most of the Irish, German, and Italian Catholics would go to the saloon. And they tended to vote Democratic because Democrats were wet, as opposed to Republicans who tended to be dry or in favor of prohibition because they felt that alcohol caused many of the social problems of urban areas. And they tried to close these saloons down, culminating in the 18th Amendment of Prohibition. Coney Island was another famous place in New York where people could go for entertainment. Horse racing track or harness racing would go on. Circuses would set up here during the summertime, and there's all sorts of iron rides that people could ride. Some of these pavilions would have displays of some of the wares of entrepreneurs and other inventors. Women had less leisure time than working men. Women were not really welcome in saloons. If they did come into the saloons, they were usually required to come in a side door or a back door. If they came in, they're usually coming in trying to fetch a growler of beer for their husbands, or their daughters would come in trying to fetch beer for their fathers. And that was about the only time they were welcome. Or they would set up an area in the back that was strictly for women. Their recreation would be with other women while they were washing clothes, supervising children at play, or shopping at the local marketplace. Social policy of the late 19th and early 20th century was heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and his biological studies, and it influenced more than a century of political and social debate, because social Darwinism was invented out of his biological studies. It was applied to human society by people like Herbert Spencer, a leading social philosopher, and the first major proponent of what came to be called social Darwinism, the idea that societies, like species in nature, are also competing, and only the survival of the fittest is going to justify your existence. This is the engine of social progress. And Darwin did not agree with these theories, but many others embraced them. Social Darwinism then influenced political policies such as the economic idea of laissez-faire. Government should not be getting involved in the marketplace because naturally this will evolve, and the fittest people like Rockefeller and Carnegie justifiably came to dominate these markets because they were the best people in oil, steel, and other areas. Swift in beef and meat packing. McCormick in developing some of those farm implements. John Deere. They should have dominated these industries. It's only natural. They argued against regulation of a business or requiring minimum standards of sanitation and housing. To Spencer and his many followers, the only acceptable charity was voluntary, and even that was of dubious value. Spencer warned that fostering the good-for-nothing people at the expense of the good is an extreme cruelty to the health of civilization. There's reaction to this. The Reform Darwinists came in. Spencer was largely supported in the United States by Yale professor William Graham Sumner. He's in favor of rugged individualism, which is basically the same thing, survival of the fittest. It's good for people to pull themselves up by their own bootstrap and survive. But opposed to that is Lester Frank Ward, who was a federal government employee who had fought his way up from poverty, and he never lost his empathy for the underdog. His book, Dynamic Sociology, introduces a real interesting idea that it's not competition, but cooperation that can promote social progress. Because we have brains. We are a blank slate when we are born, and we can change through proper education and through proper opportunity. If we can get rid of poverty, if we can get rid of people starving, people's minds can then develop properly. And this will do more than anything else to contribute to the betterment of society. And because of that, eventually people will be able to make a proper living for themselves. And Ward's concept of reform Darwinism will be one of the pillars of the progressive movement that will develop in the early 20th century and after. And that's it for this part of the Gilded Age.